camping isn't for everyone. No toilets, exposure to the elements, creatures roaming free. And those creatures aren't always of the fuzzy, woodland variety. If that wasn't enough to dissuade you from packing up your gear and marching out into woods, keep listening for some particularly creepy camping stories that will keep you out of the wilderness for good. A few years back, AGH, an archaeologist, was among a group of people doing a survey in the middle of a forest. The crew had gone home, and only AGH and his boss were left to finish up some mapping miles away from the furthest town. They made their way out further into the bush, about an hour out. As soon as they arrived, the entire area felt off. AGH and his boss pushed the feeling away in favor of their work. About 15 minutes in, they hear a loud whomp sound. Both stopped, thinking the sound must have been their imagination. Then, they heard it again. This time, it was so loud that they both felt pressure on their bodies and got goosebumps all over. They fled the site as quickly as possible. A decade later, thinking about it still freaks AGH out. Kiesler and his girlfriend were on a road trip through California when they found a relatively empty campsite. They set up camp, made dinner, and went to bed. In the middle of the night, they were woken by someone whistling outside their tent to the tune of When the Saints Come Marching In. They laid in utter silence, hoping the singing person would go away. But then the whistling turned to chanting, "When you sleep here, you disrespect me, and when you disrespect me, you disrespect the U.S. Marines." Kiesler knew they needed to get out. They quietly climbed from their tent into their truck and drove to a motel in the neighboring town. The next morning, they drove back to the campsite to retrieve the belongings they'd left behind. As they were leaving, they paused at a site adjacent to where they had slept, where a family had been staying. The family told Kiesler that the singing had continued for another 2 to 3 hours after they'd left, and it was one of the creepiest things they'd ever experienced. When Jim Danger was 18, he and some friends took a road trip to the Apalachicola National Forest near Tallahassee, Florida. Their goal was to get away from people. So, they found themselves driving far into the woods. After they set up camp and had a few drinks, the rider and a friend decided to explore the surrounding forest. They found another trail and started following it, but the further they went, the more apparent it became that someone was living there. Eventually, they came to the campsite of an older man who was living out of his van. His clothes were strung up, coolers were scattered around, and a dog sprawled beside the van. The user and his friend tried to back out without being seen, but the man caught sight of them and called them over. He asked them friendly questions and offered up some places they should check out in the park. After about 10 minutes of talking, they returned to their own campsite. The man was a little strange, but seemed perfectly harmless. But fast forward 2 months, and the Reddit user's friend calls and tells him to turn on the television. There, on screen, was the man they met in the woods that night, on trial for 4 murders. Jackman was camping in the Florida Keys near a quarry and an old dump site. One day, someone showed up at their camp and said they needed to move further from the dump site. He was planning on cleaning up the junk and burning some of the refuse in the area. The user moved, and that night the men started burning. Both parties went about their business. That night, the peaceful camping trip took a turn. They woke to the sound of scratching outside their tent. When they opened their eyes, they found their tent was covered in hundreds of rats. They shook off as many as they could before climbing from the tent. The rats had gone, but the rider was too freaked to go back to sleep. Instead, they started a fire and stayed up for the rest of the night. The next night, the Reddit writer fell asleep hesitantly but thought it would be okay because the men had finished their burning. Yet, again, they woke on the second night to their tent covered in rats. They used the same strategy, shaking the tent until the little critters fell off, then starting a fire. But after this they'd had enough. They packed up their things and headed back for the highway. As they were walking along the road, they came upon the dead body of a giant alligator. Suffice it to say, they had their fill of camping in Florida. Etsura had just watched an episode of Are You Afraid of the Dark about the Jersey Devil when their father took them hunting. While they were deep in the woods, waiting for the deer to emerge, the Reddit user caught sight of a little figure on the ground. It looked human, but because they were at a distance and it was dark, they could hardly make it out. Since Etsura was just 12 and it was 3 in the morning, the best they could tell was that the figure was 2 or 3 feet tall. For hours, the writers sat and watched this figure. The longer they watched it, the more they were certain it was the Jersey Devil. It had to be. When the two finally stood to leave, they walked toward the figure, and it was revealed what it really was, a lawn gnome. Every summer when Camel went to visit their dad, the two would take trips into the mountains. On one trip, however, their experience left them incredibly uneasy. They were hiking down a steep slope when they saw an old rifle sticking from a tree. It looked like the tree had grown around the barrel many years before. They went to get a closer look and found a small cave. Inside, the two found a handful of aged personal belongings that made it seem as though the cave had once been inhabited. There were 3 cans of unopened food, a rusted cast iron pot, an old saddle and bridle set, and a deteriorated wool blanket. They unrolled the blanket, and here's where things got really freaky. Inside, they found a shirt with holes and bloodstains crumpled up. The writer's father estimated the gun they found in the tree to have been from the 1870s, meaning whoever had been shot, and most likely killed, in those woods likely died around that same time. Rex and their family were camping on a lake in central Texas. On the first night, they were playing Pictionary by the campfire when they saw a light fly by over the lake. For a moment, they didn't think much of it and instead continued the game. Then, another went by at the same speed, following the exact same trajectory as the first. They were reddish-yellow orbs with no sound coming from them. After about 15 of the orbs went by, a faster, smaller, white one came in behind the rest. Then they were all gone. Not much was said about the event for the rest of the trip, but when they returned home, their mother looked up what the lights could have been. She discovered that people in a town a few miles from where they'd been camping also reported seeing the lights. No one had an explanation for what they were.